This diagram here gives an overview of the circulatory system. We can see starting at the heart, coming out of there are arteries. There's a few labels here, but we'll just talk about arteries in general. And then branching off from the arteries are the slightly smaller arterioles. And then branching off from all the arterioles, we have lots and lots of capillaries or capillary beds. And an example of one capillary bed is given here. Then coming out of the capillaries, we have the venules, going into small veins, larger veins, and back to the heart. So the blood's under quite high pressure while it's in the arteries and arterioles and moving fairly quickly. And then a lot of that pressure and the speed at which it's flowing is lost in the capillaries. And that gives the capillaries a chance to exchange things like gases, like oxygen and carbon dioxide, or nutrients with the different cells of the body. So most of the cells in our body are supplied by different capillaries. So we have lots and lots of them. And then in the venules and veins, the blood's under much less pressure. And it's got carbon dioxide in it, a lot of carbon dioxide in it at this point. Whereas when it's come from the heart and before it reaches different cells of the body, it's got a lot more oxygen in it. So we just go over here. We can sort of look at this table here, just a bit about the composition of blood. So a lot of it is water, and then we have different proteins in there. These albumins and globulins, one of their main jobs is actually just to help transport around hormones. And hormones are just different signaling molecules in a multicellular organism like our cells. The different types of cells in our bodies need to communicate with each other. So that's why we have different hormones. And again, these proteins, these two here, help carry around those hormones. And we have different ions. These are particularly, they're carried around in our blood, and they're particularly important for our neurons, for creating the charges that are necessary for our neurons to function. Then we have the different nutrients, glucose from carbohydrates, amino acids from proteins, and we have lipids or fats. And then we have the gases, which is what we're going to look at in a bit more detail in a moment, the actual diffusion of gas in the capillaries. Hormones, we just talked about as cell signaling molecules. And wastes like urea. So urea is sort of a byproduct that we don't need. That is the result of the breakdown of amino acids or proteins, sometimes called deamination, creates sort of urea. Okay, just one thing also that's in our blood. We have red blood cells in our blood, and inside those we have hemoglobin molecules. And they're just protein structures that are particularly good at transporting around oxygen. So if we move this oxygen molecule over there, hemoglobin helps bind the oxygen and it actually carry it around in the blood. It can also bind carbon dioxide, but a lot of the carbon dioxide is actually just diffused into the blood itself and doesn't have to be carried around on hemoglobin in the same way that oxygen does, although it can bind to hemoglobin, some does. Okay, so back to the overall diagram here. We're just going to do a bit of a close-up on a cell. Imagine a cell lying under a capillary, and it might be a muscle cell, especially a muscle cell just after exercise that's been producing a lot of ATP. We'll do a close-up of a cell and a capillary line on top of it. So if we look at this picture here, just pretend this is a muscle cell. So we've got the blood coming from the arterioles, which is these red dots here indicate oxygen molecules. So the blood that's come from the arteries and arterioles from the heart, it's got a lot of oxygen in it. And let's imagine this is a muscle cell that's been we've been exercising. So it's been making a lot of ATP in cellular respiration, and a byproduct of that is carbon dioxide. So there's quite a lot of carbon dioxide, which are these blue molecules here. So what will happen is, because of the different concentrations, because there's not much oxygen left in this cell, the oxygen will want to diffuse down a concentration gradient. That's just a fancy word, diffusing down a concentration gradient. is a fancy way to say that if there's a high concentration, it's going to try and move to where there's a low concentration, like inside this cell. And so the oxygen will diffuse out of the capillary here. And then into the capillary will diffuse some carbon dioxide, because we've got a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the cell, but at this point, it's fairly low in the blood. So we've got carbon dioxide fusing in, and then it flows out of here, out of the capillaries, and then goes into the venules, and eventually back to the heart here. So that's just a little bit about how gas diffusion in the capillaries works. Okay, so now we're going to move on and look a bit more at the heart. So we've got the heart here, sort of at the center of this, pumping everything around. And then this is just a really crude diagram. Probably should have got a better one. Anyway, it does show the parts. So we have, when we look at it, we call this the right-hand side, sort of reversed. So the right atrium accepts the blood coming back from our body, and then the blood gets pumped into the the right ventricle. Right atrium, I meant to say. The right atrium goes to the right ventricle, and then that goes to the lungs to get oxygenated. It comes back from the lungs into the left atrium, and then into the left ventricle. And not shown in this diagram, the most muscular bit of our heart is around the left ventricle, because it's really got to do quite a big contraction to sort of push that and pump that blood around the body. So just focusing a little bit more on the heart, we're going to now look also this diagram, a so-called ECG or electrocardiogram, and how it relates to the different parts of how the heart contracts. So we have this P wave at the start, and what it relates to is basically the contraction of the right atrium here. So there's in fact, it's the contraction of both of the atriums. They both contract at the same time. And their job is to basically just push the blood into the ventricle. And then we have this QRS complex, much bigger. You can see the activity here is much, much higher. That's because the activity needed to contract the ventricles is much more. They've got a much bigger job to do. So that's the QRS complex. And notice there's a bit of a gap between the P and the QRS. So basically the P is the contraction of the atriums, which just squeezes the blood into the ventricles. But there's a bit of a pause that our heart does, and that's to ensure that the blood actually gets pumped from the atrium into the ventricle, because we don't want the ventricle to fire or to squeeze until the blood from the atrium has actually entered in there. So that's why there's this gap here. And these dots I've got on here help with that. So this is called the SA node, the sinoatrial node. And what it does, so when it fires, basically it provides the electrical activity to basically make the atrium contract. And then it also activates this node here, the AV node. And when it fires, so it's a nerve, it makes the ventricles contract. So basically, when the SA node activates, that's the P wave, the contraction of the atrium. And then when the AV node fires, it contracts the ventricles, seen here in the QRS complex here in the ECG. The T wave here is just representative of when the ventricles relax. And there are actual names for the contraction. So the P represents the so-called systole of the atrium, which is the contraction or the squeezing. And then the QRS complex is the systole of the ventricles. And then this T wave is the so-called diastole or relaxation of the ventricles here. So hopefully that just explains a little bit about how the ECG or the electrical activity of the heart actually relates to the contraction of the different areas of the heart. So finally, just got a diagram here that we're not going to go into much, but just to show that this looks like a system of veins or blood vessels, but actually it's lymph vessels. So we have another whole network of vessels that carry around lymph tissue, and especially they carry around different white blood cells or different cells of the immune system, basically. So the immune system itself is a really big topic. So we won't go right into it much here, but just to know we do have this separate system here, and there is a lot of interchange between the cells in the lymph system and in the blood. So white blood cells, they can either be in the lymph system or they do cross over to the blood as well, but a lot of the time they're in the lymph system. And again, we won't go into too much detail of that, more focus on the other parts we've looked at.